Production of Real Ag is made possible in part by an underwriting grant from
Kansas Farmers Union, working to protect and enhance the economic interests and quality of life for family farmers, ranchers, and our rural communities. Learn more about our mission of education, cooperation, and legislative advocacy at kansasfarmersunion.org.
That's one of the problems sometimes, is that we expend an awful lot of money on research to find out if a chemical does something to kill insects or to remove them, but we don't spend a whole lot on figuring out if it kills things we don't want it to kill, how long it persists, what it does to our own human bodies, and we don't spend much money on could planting these plants next to each other actually help us. We're not spending money on that.
You are what you eat. It's a tired old saying. We probably heard one of our grandparents say it. But it's true. Our entire body is made out of the things we consume. So, what are we eating? And beyond that, where is it coming from? What's the history? What are the consequences of what we consume? Not just for our bodies, but for our minds. And beyond that, the planet. Because what we often forget is what we eat impacts the world around us. Our air, our water, our soil, our society. Every choice on our plates impacts the world around us in more ways than we often think. Agriculture is not just about growing crops and raising animals. It's about the environment we live in, the economy we rely on, and the future we create. So, let's dive a little deeper, shall we? This is Real Ag.
And how long is the show?
Each one's going to be about 26 minutes.
Oh, wow. Yeah, you got a job to do.
Yeah, no kidding. Between you two and Tyrone, it's quite a bit of information.
Oh, Tyrone will be in the same show.
Yes.
Yeah, so you've got to distill all three of us. Yeah, it'll be a great show.
Thanks, Marcia. I think it will be a great show. We've got two brilliant scientists and a modern pioneer in pesticide-free farming. But before we get into all of this, let's go over a few things. When we go to the grocery store and see a ridiculous amount of colorful fruits and vegetables, it's easy to overlook the unseen players in our food story. Pesticides. For years, these chemicals have played a huge role in protecting our crops, ensuring larger yields, and a more reliable food supply, but their widespread use has been raising more than a few questions. What are these chemicals? Are we relying on these chemicals a bit too heavily? How are they affecting the environment? And how are they affecting our health? These questions are more than just food for thought. They are the ones that need to be asked. Because understanding pesticides is not just for farmers and scientists, it's crucial for every consumer. It's knowledge that can lead to making informed choices about what we eat, how it's grown, and the impact on our health, as well as the planet's. And while we can't cover the full complexity of pesticides in a 26-minute show, let's dive into some intriguing points. So let's start here. There's plenty of different types of pesticides, but there are four main ones used in agriculture: insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, and rodenticides. Insecticides are what you think. They're designed to control and eliminate the insect pests that can damage crops. Herbicides are used to manage unwanted vegetation or weeds. Fungicides, also called by some people fungicides, are used to control fungal diseases that can affect plants. And rodenticides, yep, it's what it sounds like, used to control populations of rodents that pose a threat to crops. Now, in the vast farmlands of Kansas, an herbicide called Atrazine is playing a big role. Farmers here and around the United States have relied on it to control weeds and boost their harvests. And while atrazine has been viewed as a cornerstone in American agriculture, the call to take a closer look isn't really a choice. It's a responsibility towards sustainable agriculture and the delicate balance of our shared ecosystem.
My work primarily focuses on the role of hormones in amphibian development, and for the last 20 years, I focused on environmental contaminants, particularly pesticides, that interfere with hormone synthesis and function.
Meet Tyrone Hayes, a trailblazing biologist whose research has grown well beyond the confines of traditional scientific circles. Tyrone's work has been nothing short of incredible and has really shed light on the intricate connections between amphibians and the chemicals that surround them. Particularly, atrazine.
So what is atrazine, and could you explain a little bit of your history with it? I know you've given entire TED Talks on it, so it's a very big question, but if you had to kind of walk people through the highlights that had no idea.
So atrazine is a so-called triazine herbicide. It's primarily used on monocot crops like corn, for example, but it's also used in forestry when they're replanting trees. It's also used on golf courses. The biggest use in the United States is on corn. It's an herbicide that's used as a pre-emergent, meaning that it's applied to the soil before the crops are planted. And the idea is that it eliminates broadleaf weeds that would otherwise compete with the crop that's being planted. At the time that I was asked to study atrazine, in 1998, it was the number one selling agrochemical in the world for the largest chemical company in the world, Novartis. It's now been replaced by glyphosate or Roundup as the number one used chemical, but it's still, I think we're still using something like 500 million pounds a year of atrazine, and it is the most common contaminant of drinking water, groundwater, rainwater, etc. still.
And that includes Kansas. In fact, in 1989, this report was written after it was found that atrazine was found in water more than any other agricultural chemical. The report's conclusion was that the continued presence of atrazine represents an unknown health risk. But that was back in 1989.
I worked on amphibians, and I was asked by the manufacturer at the time, Novartis, to first screen the literature and figure out what was known about atrazine effects. But then I was contracted as a researcher at the university to study effects of atrazine on amphibians. And what we found was that atrazine disrupted reproductive development. In amphibians, it caused a reduction in the size of the larynx, so it prevented laryngeal growth in males, primarily because it causes a decrease in testosterone. It also feminized frogs in the sense that it causes genetic males to grow ovaries, and in some species it causes even genetic males with testes to grow eggs in their testes. It causes genetically male frogs to either not reproduce at all, to not be competitive in a situation where they're competing for females. It causes some males to prefer to copulate with other males, so it induces same-sex behavior. And fish causes reduced testosterone, reduced sperm, reduced male sexual behavior, and can feminize fish, multiple species of fish. And reptiles, atrazine causes, in caiman, it's like an alligator, it causes a reduction in testosterone, reduction in sperm, and decreased size of the penis in exposed reptiles. And it also induces eggs in the testes of exposed turtles. In birds, it causes a reduction in testosterone and a reduction in sperm. And in mammals, atrazine has a number of reproductive effects. It causes a reduction of testosterone in rats. It causes abnormal penis development in mice. So small penis, deformed penises called hypospadias, as well as it prevents the testicles from descending into the scrotum. And it causes prostate disease in rats that are exposed in utero. It also is associated with the same effects in humans. It's associated with micropenis when humans are exposed in utero. It's associated with micropenis, hypospadias, and non-descendant testes. It's associated with prostate cancer in humans working in the atrazine factories. It causes increased incidence of breast cancer in rodents and rats, and it's associated with an increase in breast cancer in humans. And it is associated with low sperm count in humans.
And this is the second most used chemical in the United States for agriculture.
The second most used chemical and the most frequently found contaminant of water.
And if that's not enough, atrazine can travel. It can really travel.
Even if you're living in a community that doesn't use atrazine, it's been shown that it can travel 1,000 kilometers in the atmosphere. So it goes up on dust. I've heard from the USGS that they can measure atrazine in Minnesota from applications in Kansas. The European Union banned atrazine because even though France banned it, they were still getting it 1,000 kilometers away from use in Germany. So the European Union refused to regulate it anywhere because of that transport, not just through the air, but through the water, through streams, through rivers, etc.
I had no idea about that. So it can really, not just travel a small distance, it can really, really travel.
It's really hard to find a place that hasn't had some atrazine contamination in the world, globally. We use over 80,000 synthetic chemicals. Most of them haven't been tested for these kinds of things. Most of them were put on the market before the EPA existed. For example, atrazine came on the market 1958. EPA didn't exist until 1972, 73. So it was on the market long before. And so now the EPA is playing a lot of catch up with, geez, we have 80,000 chemicals to review. And they're playing that catch up with interference from the manufacturers who, of course, don't want those chemicals removed from the market. For example, in the year 2020, the EPA concluded, this is 20 years after I published my research, the EPA published on their website, you can read this, they said, quote, atrazine is likely to adversely affect 54% of all species and 40% of critical habitats. So more than half of all species and almost half of all critical habitats are affected by atrazine, according to the EPA in 2020. And in that same year, in 2020, the EPA reapproves atrazine for use.
We have a revolving door in our government agencies where people from corporations, these ag corporations, are moving in and out of the regulatory agencies that are supposed to be monitoring and regulating them.
Meet Marcia Ishii, the senior scientist and director of the Grassroots Science Program at the Pesticide Action Network. With a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology, Marcia is a leading expert on the ecological, social, and political dimensions of food and agriculture.
We're playing catch up, but we've been playing catch up. The evidence has been clear. The writing has been on the wall for decades of the harms of these chemical pesticides to, human health, implicated with cancer, with reproductive disorders, with hormonal endocrine system disorders, with brain development in our kids, neurological disorders. So we have all of that. That is being driven by this pesticide treadmill we've been on.
This concept of a pesticide treadmill is an important one. It's kind of like this. At first, pesticides help farmers control pests and everything seems fine. But over time, some pests can become resistant to the pesticides. To deal with this, farmers use even more pesticides and the cycle repeats, with pests getting stronger and farmers using more chemicals. In addition to this, pesticide poisonings are actually on the rise.
Penn scientists and a number of other independent scientists recently did a massive literature review. It's called a systematic literature review where they looked through the data, the evidence, the scientific papers, and found that, in fact, pesticide poisonings are on the rise. It's not that we think oh, we're doing better, we're learning more, we've got some more regulations. But globally, we're now seeing the estimate is about 44% of farmers and farm workers who are involved in agriculture experience some kind of pesticide poisoning, unintentional pesticide poisoning. So you think globally, that's hundreds of millions of people. We're talking an estimate of 385 million people today are being affected by pesticide poisonings, harms to their health. And as you mentioned, the catch-up phenomenon, like we've released these chemicals into the environment, we've promoted them, we being, oftentimes our governments, oftentimes, well, for sure, the pesticide companies. These are companies that were formed after World War II by chemical scientists who were bringing the nerve toxin, the nerve gas technology over from Germany to develop that. We've got these stockpiles, so what can we do? Oh, got a great idea. We can use them to kill things, other things.
Now, this is something we don't have a ton of time to get into, but is a really interesting piece of forgotten history. Nazi scientists during World War II crafted pesticides as lethal nerve gases. And after the war was over, this innovation didn't just fade away. It transformed agriculture and continues to impact our modern world in more than a few ways.
So the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, the health crisis, all of these things, there are many factors driving these crises, but it turns out that chemical pesticides show up in all of these places as one of the key drivers. So let's take the climate crisis. Extraction of fossil fuels from the earth, this is all contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. Driving your car contributes to that. But pesticides, chemical pesticides and fertilizers are a big culprit in this process. Synthetic pesticides are actually petrochemicals, so they are derived from petroleum. And it turns out that, ExxonMobil, Chevron, the major oil and gas industry, as well as, the companies, the pesticide companies people are familiar with, like Bayer and Monsanto, they all are the manufacturers and the producers of pesticides, of these synthetic chemical pesticides.
Another issue has been the biodiversity crisis. Pesticides, which were intended to target pests, have backfired, harming non-target species, disrupting ecosystems, and contributing to the decline of pollinators.
We're in the midst of what scientists consider to be an extinction, a biodiversity extinction, loss of pollinators, even just there's a study out of Germany, loss of just insect biomass. Like, it's noticeable enough that the insects in the forest are significantly reduced, and that's happening worldwide. Some people might say fewer bugs, that's not a problem for me. But bugs and all the variety, the great diversity of insects are a key part of our ecosystem of life.
That's right. Insects are the misunderstood players in our ecosystem. And whether we know it or not, these tiny little wonders are essential for pollination, waste management, and keeping the world in balance. But it's understandable why they've gotten such a bad rap over the years. Check out this old piece made by the USDA. It makes insects seem like the villain in a horror movie.
This product of natural selection, this segmented, walking, crawling, flying, gigantic insect zoo is, in all the animal kingdom, the most successful to challenge man's dominion of Earth.
Challenge man's dominion for Earth. My goodness. I wonder what they would say about weeds.
Weeds, our silent enemy.
Boy, this is the strangest horror movie I have ever seen. And as much as I'd like to show you about 20 other clips from this film, I think it's time to move on to something a little bit brighter. We've spent plenty of time exploring the challenges and risks associated with widespread pesticide use, so let's pivot towards a different option: the world of pesticide-free farming and agroecology.
I understand. I'm coming from a completely different perspective. I'm working it, I'm believing it, and I have been directly harmed by pesticides. So of course it's natural for me to feel this way, except that I see evidence that this works.
Meet Rob Foe, the mastermind behind Genuine Foe Farm near Tripoli, Iowa. In 2012, an unexpected pesticide poisoning ignited Rob's mission to reshape Iowa's pesticide story. armed with years of experience, he is someone who is really shaking up the status quo.
A lot of people would hear the words or hear the term pesticide-free farm and wonder how that works. How does that work?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Now, I'm going to start by being perfectly honest. When we first started this farm in 2004, we inherited some land that was, when we purchased it, of course, that land was grown using a pesticide-intensive system. It was part of a large row crop operation, and we took some chunks around where our house is out of that production because that's what we owned. And the process of converting from a pesticide-driven system was difficult because we had decided not to use pesticides, and the system had become reliant on them. So it is really, really difficult once you get into this cycle of using it, killing off pretty much everything that you can, including the beneficial insects. And we need to remember, beneficial insects have maybe one generation every year, and the pests typically have multiple generations every year. So if you spray a broad spectrum insecticide, for example, you're going to kill that single generation of predators and maybe one or two of the generations of the pests. And so it takes time for the system to recover. And we had to go through that process. But we found, however, that if we spent our time working on rebuilding the ecology of the place that we work and we grow, by doing things like having very diverse cropping, using very strong and long-term rotations. So instead of having a 2-year rotation of corn and soybeans, suddenly our farm had a 7-year rotation, rotating different crops, vegetable crops, with different families. So now suddenly we're not working on a 2-year rotation where the insects could potentially develop or how shall we say, evolve to handle the current cycle. One good example in Iowa is we've got corn borer problems, of course, because we grow lots of corn. And the most common rotation is corn and soybeans. And it turns out that corn borers do not necessarily all hatch after 1 year. If they lay the eggs in 1 year, they could stay dormant 2 years. So of course, you know what happens when you do an every other year rotation. When they awake the next year, of course, then and there's soybeans there, they don't do so well. But what has ended up happening now is the world has selected for, or at least we have selected for, those that stay dormant for 2 years. So now suddenly you've got corn borers who are hatching every other year and saying, haha, I've got you figured out. So by having a longer rotation, suddenly you're providing both areas for the predators to survive, and you're also providing a little bit of confusion factor for some of the pests that are particularly bad.
And that's agroecology. It emphasizes the intricate relationships between plants, animals, humans, and the environment, in contrast to the modern version of ag, which has become heavily reliant on chemicals. But just how effective can this be?
One of the things we did one year is we said, we're going to stop growing as many melon plants as we had been planting in the past, because, you're trying to make enough to make money. So sometimes you think, let me plant more and I'll get more melons and I'll make more money. We did the exact opposite. We planted 30%, 33% less melon plants one year. And we replaced that with flowers that we felt might support some of the pollinators. But we figured, we'll just take the loss. If we get this lower production level, that's fine. And we went through the process. We treated the flowers like a crop. We watered them. We kept them weeded, the whole bit. And at the end of the year, we started harvesting. And when I looked at my numbers, we had 1/3 higher production in that same area than we had before. So we added diversity, and we actually increased the productivity per row foot than we had before for where the plants were. Plus, I liked being in the field. I liked seeing the flowers. There were lots of pollinators. There were bees everywhere. There were all kinds of other pollinators everywhere. And I started to learn it's not just honeybees. I'm looking at bumblebees. I'm looking at hoverflies. I'm looking at all kinds of things that are actually visiting and helping to pollinate my crop. If that doesn't sell a person, I don't know what does. It was a good field to be in. in case there are people out there who are like, well, that was probably a 1-year fluke, we did the same thing the next year and the year after and the year after and had similar numbers each year. Always about 30% better than what we had been getting for 30% less plants than what we had been planting. So, this has been replicated over multiple years when the weather can be very different each time. But again, remember, our farm went through the process of transition, and this is at a later stage after we transitioned and started building up the ecosystem services. So we had a healthy environment to work with when we took this next step.
So, to wrap everything up, pesticides, which were born from a wartime innovation, have become a double-edged sword in modern agriculture. Their use has raised alarms about environmental degradation, human health, and the ever-daunting pesticide treadmill. So, I asked all of our experts if they had one thing to tell everyone on Earth about pesticides. What would it be?
I would say use with caution, and I say it that way. My first response was to say don't do it, but I think we have to go on a case-by-case basis. I think we have to look at what's needed and what's at risk and weigh things carefully. So I'm not Mr. Anti-pesticide, let's get rid of chemicals. I'm case-by-case basis, examine what the chemical is, how it impacts, and what the benefits and costs are. And by benefits and costs, I mean benefits and costs to the environment, to environmental health and the public health, not in any kind of financial way.
We have embraced a system too broadly where we use chemicals as the solution, as opposed to perhaps it's a tool that you resort to in the worst circumstance instead of we just always use it because it seems to work and it makes it easy. I have news for you. If you want to farm well, farming well requires more skill than mounting a sprayer and killing things that aren't the crop you want.
I mean, this all sounds really terrible, right? Gloom and doom. And it is pretty disturbing that we've let things go this far. And we've really handed over our food systems in many cases to these agrochemical corporate giants. But what I do want to say is, like, we've got farmers like Rob, we've got farmers all over the world. And we have in many cases increasingly national governments saying, we want off this chemical treadmill. We have Mexico making a nationwide conversion to agroecology. We have many European countries increasing their regulation and their limitations on pesticides.
And to just give you a brief idea of what we can do, our farm is 15 acres in size. That's not very big in the grand scheme of Kansas or Iowa or Nebraska or whatever. That's tiny. We produced in our peak years 15 tons of produce. That's 15 tons for 15 acres of just the produce. That is not counting the poultry that we raised or the eggs that they produced, and it doesn't count apple crops from our apple trees. And I'm not saying we could do that every single year. I'm just saying look at that potential, that you can have a bunch of small farms producing tons of food that can be eaten right away, doesn't have to go through processing, and that is pesticide free. Imagine that. Just have 100 acres in every county in Kansas or every county in Iowa that's dedicated to this kind of production. How much food is that, folks?
Production of Real Ag is made possible in part by an underwriting grant from
Kansas Farmers Union, working to protect and enhance the economic interests and quality of life for family farmers, ranchers, and our rural communities. Learn more about our mission of education, cooperation, and legislative advocacy at kansasfarmersunion.org.